I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. I have hit record.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. There's something about the way you start like.
I'm like,
comporting yourself.
I don't know. I think this time I just hit record because I don't know.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
else
You were
talk
either,
about
it was
it?
either that or yeah. Yeah.
We were
either
gonna
that you
prepare.
were. Well, you asked yourself the question, what notes did I take? And then the option was either to just read your notes or to just get on with it.
I mean, even like I don't know. I wrote these notes 2 hours ago.
Yeah.
And I don't get it.
Yeah.
There's like a mind map, and it's like, what? What was I thinking? I don't know. Whatever.
Yeah, they don't help me much.
Yeah.
There was something that I underlined, put some stars next to it, exclamation marked it.
Yeah, I don't know. What are you gonna do? You know what, Dan? What do we care? We've been involved in the real struggle today, haven't we? We've been taking industrial action, or whatever, in a very middle class way.
Hanging out on the picket line.
Hanging out on the picket lines.
Yeah.
It's a good feeling.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was worried going into the strikes, I guess, that it was, I don't know. I think there's been one thing on my mind, which has been like, for every strike and protest I feel like that I've ever attended or been a part of or whatever, it's always been like, there's such a social element of like, this is the cool thing to do, and if you don't do it, it's not cool, as opposed to like, it is the right thing to do, if that makes sense. And it's always rubbed me a little bit the wrong way, but like, I don't know, today felt good. Today it was like, yeah, okay, this is people getting together for things that actually matter. But yeah, I don't know, I still can't shake that like social aspect of it all, if that makes sense. And I don't mean social in like a Marxist way. I mean it in a way that's much more like your experience of going to protests is flavored by like it being the like cool thing to do, and it almost seems very middle class. I don't know.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Well, it was an experience of protesting with people whose actual material existence is on the line.
That's
you know?
true. Yeah.
People had skin in the game.
Skin in the game. Yeah.
And knew where to direct it.
Yeah.
So there were fiery speeches given.
Yes, there were.
And the enemies were pointed out.
Yeah, literally. It's like, geez.
So it was good. Yeah, I found it quite uplifting.
It was uplifting, I think. Yeah. I was worried not many people were going to show up, and then a good amount of people showed up, so I was glad that it wasn't just me being an asshole by not showing up to work. It was good. Yeah.
If anybody doesn't know, there is a national strike by the University and Colleges Union, which started today and lasts for another 3 days, 3 consecutive days.
3 consecutive days, baby.
Over just about everything you can imagine it being over. Because like the universities are mostly just assholes.
Yeah, it's not great. It is more and more an American style system, obviously, which is to just say a capitalist system, and it's just, it's not great. Not great, folks. And yeah, it's cool. It's funny explaining to people, though. It's like, oh yeah, I'm going on strike, and they're like, wow, cool, how long is it going to be? And it's like 3 days, and it's like, you know that it's going to be 3 days? It is very funny that it is just a like, here are these 3 days where none of us will be working, and then we'll all get back to it. You know what I mean? It would be cool if it was just like it wouldn't end.
Indefinite.
Yeah, just rolled into the Christmas break or whatever, and then it was like, we'll still be on strike when we come back if none of this is figured out. But I don't know, it's such a big fucking thing.
Yeah. People wouldn't survive it.
People wouldn't survive, that's it. Yeah.
The UCU in the past have done scaling things, right? So there was a really big UCU strike. I'm trying to remember whether it was the early part of 2020 or the spring term of 2019. I think there were UCU strikes in both. I think it might be the 19 one I was thinking about, where they kind of did 2 days the first week, 3 days the second week, 4 days the next week, 5 days the week after.
Oh, that's cool.
And it was protracted over many weeks, and really maybe it ended up being like 6 or 9. Like the students lost like 9 weeks of teaching from those, or something mental. Yeah.
When was this? Like
2019, I think.
Okay, gotcha. Oh wow, jeez.
Yeah.
I would have been here for that. Really? Did they around here? Did they strike?
Yeah.
What the hell? Maybe I do remember that. Where was I? Just living in a box, probably.
We're doing it in the spring, so was that your term?
No,
abroad?
I might have been. I think I was just working at the pub, honestly. So it might have just gone by me, but you'd think I would have known about it. I don't know. Whatever. Whatever.
Yeah. Everybody's lives are so mixed up and upside down. Nobody knows what time it is, a day it is, a year
exactly.
it is.
Yeah. Man, what a joke about like the other local school that couldn't go on strike. I didn't know about this, that like here, if you want to go on strike, you have to have 50% of people turn out for the vote. Otherwise you can't go out on strike. That's nuts. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, 50% of the members of the union have to cast a ballot either way.
Yeah.
And then of that ballot, obviously, it has to come back
Yeah.
50% positive
Yeah.
to take an industrial action.
Yeah.
Part of the anti-trade union laws that
That's
we have
a
in this
phrase that
country.
kept getting tossed around.
Yeah.
I think also to have a picket, you need to have a like dedicated picket officer, which I find very British.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of bureaucracy around picketing.
What a joke. Yeah. Well,
Quite a tame affair, really. No
Yeah.
bricks were thrown.
no bricks were thrown, sadly.
Yet.
Not yet. That's true. 2 more days. We'll see. I was thinking about just the idea of like strikes over wages, right? And I don't know, this may be like a duh point, but like you're never really going to get solidaristic strikes if it's just over your field's wages, right? Because it's kind of just like, who cares? Like, obviously, it's the same factors affecting everybody, but it's also like, if you're just coming out there just saying like, damn, we're not getting paid a lot and we have a lot more work to do, like, yeah, it's not like you're ever going to get other unions to join you. I mean, I know that there has been the transport strike in London that's kind of coincided with this, with the underground, and they have shown like solidaristic, like, hey, right on, brother, but like, yeah.
Yeah, it has to affect you for multiple unions to strike at the same. You're not allowed to you're basically not allowed to like strike in solidarity. I think is part of the law.
Yeah.
So for multiple unions to be out at one time has to either be coordinated in the fashion that you describe, and also to there be some commonality as to what's causing you to want to strike. And I think there are also conditions over what you can and can't strike about. I think it's just
Jesus
paying
Christ.
conditions and yeah.
Is that all relatively recent? Do you know these like anti-trade?
Yeah,
laws?
they were a product of Thatcherism.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
Gotcha,
I guess
gotcha,
they came in the late 90s, or maybe they were part of a packet of laws brought in by John Major. I don't know. One of the many things that people flogged the New Labour government for was for not repealing these anti-trade union laws. And I do think that the Conservative government since 2010 has deepened some of these laws, although I don't know for certain.
Well, that's nice.
It's all very nice.
It's all very nice. Yeah, I don't know. It does seem like there can only really ever be one overarching solidaristic thing that gets people to come out in solidarity, and that would be socialism, right? But like, it'd be sure nice to see more of it. It was cool. A lot of the students came out and were like, "Hey, right on! Like, this is cool." And so that was really cool to see because, like, I don't know, I'm not like an academic or anything, but it is kind of a bummer being like, I'm not going to show up to work. Sorry. Like, I probably won't be responding to your emails. So it's like, yeah, it's cool to see that. It's cool to see that, like, people get it. And I was talking about this with someone today, like, they were kind of like, yeah, I wonder what's changed that, like, students are being more, like, solidaristic with, like, UCU or whatever. And it's like, I mean, this is the world they're going to have to go out into. You know what I mean? Most of them already probably have experience with 0-hour contracts or, like, precarious work, or whatever. So it's like, they get it. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, it's cool.
I do wonder also whether a lot of them have recent experience of being messed around by universities.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
I mean, just
last academic year in particular was like
yeah.
total joke in terms of what the degree to which students were missold.
Yeah.
The product in their quotes that they were buying.
Ugh, the commodity of education. And I mean, that's just it too. Having to pay to go to school so much. Yeah, I don't know. It's funny. Like, I don't know. That's just a thing coming from America. It's like, yeah, pay to go to school. But out here, it's like, pay to go to school? So, yeah.
Yeah,
within living memory.
It's definitely seeped its way into, I remember it being quite a big feature of this sort of student mentality, this idea that, like, I have bought these things, so
yeah,
it's my right to receive them kind of thing.
Yeah.
And they get annoyed with the lecturers. They don't get annoyed with the university.
Yeah, sure.
But that's not always the ideology that the students hold. Obviously, they're a very mixed body of person.
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, it's ironic that they would get up in arms, given that most of them don't show up to their lectures when they actually have
That's
them
true.
to, so
That's true. Yeah.
Who knows?
Well,
Who knows?
I mean, I don't know. Suffice to say, good stuff. Made me very tired. I don't know why. It exhausted
standing
me.
about in the cold.
Standing about in the cold. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I've been trying to, like, tell more people at work about, like, hey, why I'm not just going to be showing up to work for the next 3 days. A lot of people just don't get it. And one thing, I wonder what this speaks to. Well, I guess I probably know. But, like, the most common refrain from people who aren't in the union but are, like, curious, perhaps, is, like, union curious or whatever, is that, like, but I like management. I don't have anything against them. They're nice people. You know what I mean? And I find that so interesting because it's like, I'm not going to be out there with like a picture of my boss's face on the sign being like, boo you, you suck. You know what I mean? So I don't know. That's one thing that's very easy to be like, well, we're not like, management has no say. You know what I mean? Like maybe upper management, the people we never see, but like, we're not exactly protesting our specific bosses. But I find that really interesting. It is like, it has to be this like concrete individual, like the people that I come in contact with must be why they're complaining. I found that really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder if it's a matter of just connecting people to
ideas. I mean, I guess just like,
but also, where they fit in the bigger picture, kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, where are like quote unquote like, because what they meant by that was like their line management, right?
Yeah.
They didn't mean the like big bosses.
The vice chancellor of the university.
Exactly. Yeah. Is there a chancellor of the university?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, but chancellor is kind of like an honorary position.
I'd like that job.
Yeah. I don't know whether it's even paid.
Oh, but I don't want that job.
They show up and they present the certificates every year, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I can do that.
Yeah.
And they don't get paid, huh? Interesting.
Yeah, all the money goes to the vice chancellor.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, what are you gonna do? So we'll be bringing you all updates on the further UCU strikes a week after they happen. So that'll
certainly be more.
There will certainly be more. Yeah,
it sort of feels like the UCU have just been permanently on a rolling strike since like 2011.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it just seems like it's something that universities have, I hate to say it, but have just kind of learned to live with. You know what I mean? And that's deflating.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, fuck. But I don't know. What are you going to do? Anyway, what are you going to do? Mm-hmm. All right. Well, should we get into it, Dan? Yeah. Let's get into it. Okay.
Tell me what we read this week, Jack. Tell the listener.
Dear listener.
More importantly.
Dear listener, this week, Dan and I dipped our supple little toes into not post-colonial thought, colonial thought, I guess. And we read some stuff on James Connolly, who's someone...
Anti-colonial thought?
Anti-colonial thought, there you go. Yeah, not colonial thought. We read some colonial thought. Yeah, we wanted to read some stuff on James Connolly. We've been wanting to read some stuff on him for a while now, and we weren't sure kind of, I think, what to read of his. There's some good stuff of his out there, but it's kind of hard to just pick one thing and be like, I don't know, let's just talk about this, just because I feel like I, at least, don't necessarily have the historical background to talk about something like that, like a primary source in depth. So what we did is we found an essay, as we usually do, by a fellow named David Lloyd, called Rethinking National Marxism, James Connolly, and quote-unquote Celtic Communism. And it's really interesting. It started out as one thing, I think, and kind of wound up being something else, I think. But it, first of all, it kind of tries to like set about parameters for defining what national Marxism is, where you can like find a nationalist thought, what nationalist thought is, how that can be useful to Marxism. And then it kind of gets into a broader talk about revolutionary agency, I guess, and about like the proletariat and the colonial proletariat and how that differs from, say, the proletariat of the metropole. But it uses James Connolly and the struggle of Irish independence as a vehicle to have all of those talks. So it's a little bit more specific to that case. I came away with it thinking that this James Connolly fellow was pretty cool. I'd never really come into contact a whole lot with his thought, but interesting fella. What do you think?
I enjoyed this essay thoroughly, and it taught me a lot about, as you say, James Connolly's thinking. In a lot of ways, it's, what did you say before? To rescue his good name or something?
Yeah.
So it sort of starts out with this sort of explanation or introduction to how James Connolly fits into the history of the movement for Irish independence and how he's kind of been lost in amongst the ways in which Irish history developed from sort of for the latter period of the struggle for independence post the Easter Rising in 1916, and then through the birth of the Free Irish State. The movement was largely dominated by quite conservative and bourgeois thinkers, and so James Connolly's is a strain of thought in terms of the movement for Irish independence, which has kind of been forgotten and lost to some extent.
Or at least misconstrued. I think that's kind of one point.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
the
Part
author
of it is
makes.
just like this foolish Connolly kind of thing because he's sort of like obviously he's like sidelined by the mainstream of Irish thinking around the process of independence, but then also is equally criticised by socialists and Marxists for being a sort of like naive nationalist who entertained very romantic sentiments about the sort of like the nature of the Irish working class and the sort of alternate future that was presented as a possibility.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I don't, like I said, I don't know too much about this history, but I suppose we should probably try and put Connolly in context a bit. I guess he's most well known for taking pretty large part as being I think one of the main organizers, along with the Big Jim Larkin, which I think is a very funny name, of the Dublin lockout, which is not something we ever learn. None of this is something we learn about in school in America. But I believe that was a strike that went on for almost a year, went on for a really long time, and it eventually was kind of sold out by the British Labour Party, or at the very least the Trade Union Congress. So they all went back to work, and then tensions kind of re-escalated, eventually kind of culminating in the Easter Rising, and Connolly was a big part of that. And for his troubles, he was taken out back and shot by the British, along with a bunch of other people who were kind of co-conspirators. And then thus begins the like much longer, very troubled history. Although, like, crazy putting this in context, this was like 100 years ago. This is fucking insane. And it's like when you put that in context of like this was the beginning of not even the troubles, like the Civil War and everything like that, it's like, man, Ireland has a much more troubled history than at least I, from the New World, give it credit for. It's pretty brutal. Yeah, makes me want to like, I don't know, all my like old family from America or Australia. It's like you can kind of talk to them about like World War II and stuff, but it's like, wow, I'd like to know, like, talk to some old Irish people. Like, Jesus Christ, they've been through it.
Yeah, from my limited understanding, it kind of feels like there's this there are two phases almost. There's the kind of like up to 1916 and the Easter Rising in Dublin, and then post the quashing of that and the execution of Connolly and other conspirators as well, and through the sort of struggle for independence and civil war period leading up to 1922 when Ireland gained its independence, minus the northern counties that are still part of Great Britain, the United Kingdom rather. A lot of it feels like a lot of the radicalism of that period of time, particularly the Easter Rising, is sort of like erased from this piece of history.
Yeah.
One of the things that that was briefly mentioned in relationship to the Easter Rising was the degree to which Connolly and the organisers of that saw it as a gesture toward internationalist politics and the internationalist, well, anti-war. It was an act of defiance against the prosecution of the First World War by the British state, heavily influenced by the kind of internationalist thinking that was also obviously in the heads of Lenin and the Bolsheviks through this period as well, kind of thing. So certainly not simplistically a nationalist movement for independence, but one which was very much steeped in this internationalist socialist tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. As it would need to be, right? And I mean, I think going off of that, this is where like we get this phrase that I guess Connolly came up with of Celtic Communism, right? Which I guess the author here is, as we've said, like kind of trying to save Connolly's name and be like, whoa, Celtic Communism isn't what you think. Because he makes the point that a lot of Marxists over the years have kind of misconstrued that as being this like romantic look to the past that you get with like fascism, quite frankly, that's like, oh, remember when we were a much more noble people back in the day, and you know, you just kind of like look past to like your heroic past or whatever. But David Lloyd, the author here, is saying that that isn't what's happening at all. That isn't what Connolly's trying to do. And you have to like put his quote unquote like nationalism in context with the times and really emphasize the specificity of what he was talking about. There are two sentences here where he says, all too often leftist criticisms of nationalisms and so-called identity politics are hard to distinguish from a generalized liberal cosmopolitanism that forgets its own ethnocentrism. Above all, there's a self-confirming tendency to reduce the complex political and cultural dynamics of anti-colonial and anti-racist movements to the singular form that does hypostasize racial or ethnic identification, and that is generally the hallmark of populist or bourgeois ideology. So I think it basically, all that's saying is you have to recognize the specificity of Connolly's struggle. And he gets into a lot more, when he talks about agency, he kind of gets into like why specifically you look to the past of the Irish people for these like anti-capitalist tendencies. But it is really fascinating recognizing that like the basic like not all nationalism is bad, because that like the inner liberal in me is like, no, but it is. You just need to be socialist. Whereas Connolly here is saying that like the Irish workers can be pushed to a much more radical place if you like merge their like anti-colonial struggle with socialism as opposed to just socialism, I guess. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. And one of the things the author is really keen to emphasize in his advocacy, I suppose, for this kind of approach to concept of nationalist Marxism is to say, no, it's not to say that we should all be nationalist Marxists now, like screw internationalism, everybody should be operating in the same principles of looking to each nation's specific history and culture in order to develop its working class and the agency of a proletariat that can overthrow capitalism. But he's more saying that you have to look to the specificity of each case and to understand specificity, rather than what has been the tendency of a lot of Marxist theory, which is to universalize in all things.
Yeah.
This is the only way to go about any type of historical development. This is how agency and the agency that's necessary to transform society in a socialist direction comes about. A lot of this, the context and the theory in this essay fits very much into questions that we've been banding around for a little while as to Marxist interpretations of history when it comes to very strict stagism.
Yeah.
And also very specific and strict understandings of how political agency fits into the changes in history, and ideas around a specific agent, i.e. the industrial proletariat, and you can't have other types of proletariat or working classes, and the agency can't come from anywhere else. It can't possibly come from without capitalism. It has to be part of the development of capitalism. So this essay and the interpretation of Connolly's thinking that's being presented here is very much one of like, no, there is a possibility of an agency which is anti-capitalist, which comes from someplace external to capitalism, rather than it being capitalism's development, which then brings about the agent which is in a position to transform society once again. So it's very much in the tradition of messy history.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, aka history.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that just plays perfectly into Connolly, the quote I feel like that Connolly is most famous for, which is, it's something, I'm going to screw it up, something along the lines of the cause of Ireland is the cause of socialism, the cause of socialism is the cause of Ireland. And that is basically just to say, like, hey, gang, we aren't actually going to receive independence, even if we get a, like, republic, or even if we get, you know, something other than home rule from the British. Like, we're never actually going to be out from under Westminster's boot, which is one of my favorite phrases, until we actually do the socialist thing. And so, yeah.
And what's central to Connolly's interpretation of Irish history is the way in which Irish history and the process of English colonization in Ireland has so heavily influenced the development of Irish history. Like, he's seeing Irish history through the lens of English colonialism, and is therefore saying that what is key to escaping the colonization of Ireland by England is not just kicking the colonizers out, but it's actually also destroying the legacy of the system that they've introduced in place of what was there before, i.e. the introduction of the social relations of capitalism to Ireland by the English through the preceding multiple centuries, I guess.
Yeah.
And it even, I don't know whether it was in this or whether I was looking at one of the a piece by James Connolly himself, but he was almost suggesting that like the English even kind of introduced a lot of the principles of feudalism initially into Ireland, and then piggybacked off of that the transition toward capitalism kind of thing. And the legacy which Connolly is trying to champion is a kind of like is something which stems from the sort of clan history of Ireland and sentiments around communality and communal ownership of land.
That's something that's so fascinating. Also, just like this idea, I would really like to dig into material reasons like why the British, I suppose I should say labor bureaucracies, time and time again failed to support the Irish working classes, specifically during the Dublin lockout, right? Like, I had a little bit of a heart attack because I was reading this and they were like, and one of the things that spelled the end for the Dublin lockout was when the Trade Union Congress withdrew its support from Jim Larkin and from the movement in general. And I was like, wait a minute, I'm going to a UCU strike. UCU, Trade Union Congress. I was like, no, I'm a colonizer,
before you
Dan.
even reach the picket line.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing it makes me think of is, I believe it was the Bukharin that we came across. It was just like one line in Revolutionary Strategy, where he's basically just talking about the fact that first world, quote unquote, proletariats will seemingly try to protect their position because, in amongst the firm of the nation state. But this, I don't know. Like I said, I don't know too much about this, but it almost just seems like it was the bureaucracy that wanted to sell them out. The British Labour Party and the Trade Union Congress seemed like they had a lot of gains to protect, and they didn't want to be seen as supporting these trade unionists, anti-colonial folks, which seems a little nuts when you say it out loud, but like also understandable. Presumably, the big government would have come down on them in quite a harsh way had they kept up their support. But that is basically just to say there's a concrete example of what Connolly points to as a place where revolutionary agency can be seemingly at odds with the typical stagist like Marxist stagist view of history, because it's like, wait a minute, these people don't even have like a mass industrial proletariat yet, but for some reason they can be pushed in a more radical direction than the schmucks in UCU at the Trade Union Congress. And that's a really fascinating idea, and it is just something to say that, like, I don't know how many times have we said this on the show, that like when you're studying nuance or when you're studying history or sociology, you need nuance, and you need to be able to understand that, okay, things don't always play out in this stagist view of things, because wait a minute, the peasant is being more progressive than the industrial proletariat. What the hell? It's all really fascinating.
Yeah. Why are the Irish working class inside of Ireland more radical, but then also why are Irish emigres in Britain or in America, like either in like the Chartist movement or what have you, why are they so radical, and also like why do they take up leadership positions in so many key labour struggles in history, kind of thing. That's one of the things the essay and Connolly are grappling with, is like why does the Irish working class present itself as so much more radical when under a kind of like what we might describe as sort of crude Marxist understanding, you would say, well, no, the industrial capital, the proletariat of England ought to be more radical.
Yeah.
One of the things that was really interesting, though, was that he makes the argument that, well, Connolly makes the argument, and it's described in this essay, that what set in train what made it possible for the Irish working class to be so radical was the very specific conditions of British colonialism in Ireland.
Yeah.
He makes the case that if it weren't for the fact that there had been British colonialism in Ireland, Connolly seems to believe that the Irish probably would have come up with, or would have developed, a kind of like landowning capitalist class of their own.
Yeah.
But it's purely because this whole system was sort of like forced on the Irish from without, that it actually created these kind of like pockets of continued resistance and a familiarity with a legacy that existed prior to English colonization, because the social relations that were imposed by England upon Ireland were foreign rather than had a domestic origin kind of thing.
Yeah.
So he's sort of making the case that it's purely it's predicated upon the conditions of colonialism that allowed for this degree of resistance to colonialism and the capitalist social relations that were enforced by the colonizers.
Yeah, I think when I first went through this essay and saw it and read that, it kind of almost came across as a little idealistic, because I don't think I really understood it fully, because there are a couple other thinkers who were bought into this discussion. A fellow named Maria Tegui, who wrote a lot about the Inca and Spanish colonization of like what would become Peru. And this idea of like this, you could say, like germ inside of these people that is like this inherent distrust of capitalism and this inherent that there's always just this constant struggle with capitalism that is much more constant and much more like there than it would be if they had just developed capitalism themselves. Almost can come across as a little idealistic, because it can be like, you know, almost a little bit like, hey, remember when we did things in the good old fashioned way? Like that kind of like looking to the past and romanticizing the like, you know, communal Irish peasant. But when you have a like material understanding of it, like it does actually kind of fit. It makes sense that, you know, if you have this system forced upon you instead of developing it yourself, it will always seem alien no matter what. And that feeling will always be there, kind of no matter how many generations pass while you're still under this colonial system. Connolly basically says that any argument against colonialism or anything like that that isn't in the end a critique of capitalism is obviously going to wind up being bad. I really thought it was interesting. There's an essay in here that's cited that Connolly wrote about like a Celtic revival and about trying to bring back the Irish language, and he's kind of responding to that. I think it's worth quoting. It's short. He just says, "The chief enemy of a Celtic revival today is the crushing force of capitalism, which irresistibly destroys all national and racial characteristics, and by sheer stress of economic preponderance, reduces a Galway or a Dublin, a Lithuania or a Warsaw to the level of a mere second-hand imitation of Manchester or Glasgow." I think that rocks. And that is basically just like that's just like a material understanding of what can come across as, I think, a little idealistic, but it checks out.
Yeah, it's almost an appeal to the nationalists, right? Like,
yeah.
The only way to save the specificity of your culture or your history is to be a socialist and resist the sort of homogenization, the system of homogenization, which is capitalism. I mean, you have to read the manifesto to have that system, that process described to you, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And he basically says you can't separate the destruction of Gaelic culture from the emergence of capitalism, which again goes back to the, you know, the cause of Ireland, the cause of socialism or whatever. But yeah, it's fascinating. And it is, like the author says here, it makes nationalism become a contested ground, which I thought was a really fascinating way of looking at it, because it's like, yeah, don't just concede nationalism by saying having this liberal cosmopolitan view of all nationalism bad. You're conceding really valuable territory to Chuds and reactionaries and the bourgeoisie, frankly.
Yeah. One of the other people that he quotes from is an essay by, apparently famous essay by Antonio Gramsci about the conditions of the peasantry in southern Italy compared to the sort of like advanced proletariat of the north, who are industrial and work in the factory kind of thing. And Gramsci's very much falling into this trap of imagining, as I say, the industrial proletariat as being the advanced vanguard of the proletariat, the only people capable of advancing history, whereas the peasantry have this sort of like non-historical kind of like romantic and traditionalist worldview, which is totally incompatible with any kind of worldview which is progressive or forward-looking. And Gramsci's kind of describing in a very sort of conventional Marxist fashion the history and the continued existence and legacy of the lives of the peasantry as being a social form in disintegration, and not a social form which can in any way fashion itself into an active force for historical change, kind of thing. Which kind of brings us on to these the latter stages of this essay, where there's a discussion of two different ways of viewing history.
Conveniently named.
History 1 and History 2. I can't recall. Somebody Chakrabarti is the person
Chakrabarti, I believe.
who who these ideas are being drawn from. I don't know. I thought I was in a position to describe them, but maybe I'm not.
Correct me if I'm wrong, because I probably am, because I had to ask you to explain this to me beforehand. But History 1, I think, is more or less what we can just describe as a stagist view of history, which is like kind of the typical narrative of the transition to capitalism, right? Whereas History 2 is a little bit more nuanced, and it kind of has within it this understanding that the social relations inside of capitalism can contain, like, I think he says antecedents of themselves, like, and that basically is why he brings that up, is because the Inca past, as described by Maria Tegui, and the Irish past, as described by James Connolly, have this antecedent in them. They, quote unquote, remember a time when things were different to capitalism because they had this history and this mode forced upon them. And that isn't to say, I think, that Deepesh, that is his first name, nice. I believe, Deepesh Chakrabarty, is throwing the baby out with the bathwater in the sense of, like, don't ever use History 1 or History 2. I think the point, right, was just that they are two different ways of viewing history. Maybe no less valuable, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think they're both to be read together as to enable a description of history and the histories of transitions. But he's basically saying that those things which fit into the History 1 category of the emergence of capitalism are the kind of like antecedents or preconditions which are historically necessary for the development of capitalism. And then History 2 are the antecedents or the preconditions for the development of capitalism which linger within the capitalist system because they can't be excised, but they're not actually necessary for its ongoing reproduction.
Sure.
So a good example of this is the degree to which the sort of historical sentiments that continue to exist internal to the Irish working class in this period, which are legacies of their pre-colonial social life, are maintained, as we were saying before, because of the structure of colonialism, because the social system was of capitalist colonialism was imposed from without. Those things necessarily linger in a way that they may well have been erased if there'd been a natural transition, but they're not like dead or disintegrating histories in the way that Gramsci's describing the peasantry in Italy as being sort of like sort of necessarily disintegrating forms of social life. It is necessary that they linger for the continued existence and ongoing development of the capitalist logics in their colonial context and their colonial form.
I think one thing I brought up before we started recording, when we had just kind of first gone through this, is I don't think Marx necessarily did us a favor by describing the French peasantry as a sack of potatoes, insofar as the specificity of that analysis has just been put upon all peasants in a way. And I mean, like, I think it's brought up in this, but that, like, the way that Marx describes the French peasantry in the 18th Brumaire is extremely specific, and he's making the point that this isn't all peasants are this reactionary and dumb and idiots and atomized, but, like, they're already petty bourgeois, right, by that point in France. And, like, you can't have that analysis of just, like, the dumb peasantry is never going to be able to do anything because they're just a bunch of dumb peasants, and apply that to all peasants for all time. Because, I mean, as we see here, there is, like, this, like, I don't know, this history, too, that belongs to, like, the Irish peasants, where this kind of, like, old school peasantry attitude is what's given them the, like, fire in their belly to be anti-capitalist in a way that a more quote-unquote advanced working class could never be. And that's, I think, something that blew my mind reading this, was being like, wait a minute, the peasantry can be progressive in a sense, like more so than an industrial proletariat. I, like, stood up and cheered. I was like, there is still hope.
Jack the Digger.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, yes.
Yeah, one of the things that I've always been meaning to take a look at, and did take a look at for this episode, was the letter and reply that Vera Zuzulych, the early Russian Marxist, a member of the Emancipation of Labour grouping, the letter that she sent to Marx, because she sent this short letter to Marx saying, I know you say this stuff about in Capital about like the necessity of the stage transition from like feudalism to capitalism to communism, or have you? But do you see any progressive potential in the structure of the Russian Mir, and it's sort of like that's the sort of peasant commune in Russia, and that communal and collective structure for farming? Is there any potentially positive legacy that can we develop that into socialism, or do we have to follow the strict stagist view that you seem to have laid out? And part of Marx's reply is that, like, obviously I can't go into this in great detail, but this stagist structure that I've described is basically designed to describe the development of capitalism in Western Europe. It's not meant to be read as a sort of totalizing social structure, totalizing structure for the development of history all over the world in all contexts, kind of thing. Yeah,
it's impossible to have that reading because, like, as we've come across the idea, like, this is the failure of the promise. This is the failure of the bourgeois promise, right? The liberal promise. It's like, while there is a bourgeoisie, that implies that there are others who aren't. So you can't have this, like, view of history for, like, the quote-unquote more advanced Western, like, proletariat and leave out all of the, like, countries that are necessarily peasants. You know what I mean? So, yeah. That kind of made me think about like, this is kind of getting into some like, whoa, dude stuff, but about the, like, in terms of formal and real subsumption, like, what could that possibly look like for a transition to socialism? And I think we've already kind of come across this idea, right? When we looked at fundamental principles of, like, the fairly arbitrary, like, low communism and then high communism, where you kind of stamp out all of those ideas, but, like, the new society kind of having, like, marks of the old or whatever in terms of, I don't know what a world might look like with the transition to social labor time planning. I don't know. It just got me thinking about that. There's not a whole lot to say on it right now as the thoughts are still cogitating, but, like, I think we have come across this idea looking to the future and not necessarily just the past in terms of, like, well, the state might still be around for one thing, and it won't do the things that the state does now, but, you know, you'll still go to a store and kind of, quote unquote, exchange stuff to get other things to consume. There'll be means of consumption up until the point where it isn't necessary because the productive forces are so developed, right? Where you just kind of like, yeah, I don't know, just kind of take it. But yeah, I don't know. Just got me thinking about, like, real subsumption and stuff like that. It's a really fascinating idea. I love it whenever we come across an idea that's so abstract that you can just kind of throw it at other things and be like, wow, it works.
You just made me think that maybe there's a possible way of interpreting sort of very crude Marxist understandings of history, which is like, history happened in the French Revolution and the sort of general transition into capitalism, and then there isn't really any historical development, and then we have the next revolution and the history does something again, and then so all the conditions internal to that period of time, which we describe as being the capitalist mode of production, are fixed, and therefore all strategy that we might develop at one point applies to all other points in time. Whereas there's this other way of looking at it where, like, history continues to develop during these periods. And it's a daunting prospect, right? Because it means that the things that have happened before won't necessarily work again. You only have to read something like E.P. Thompson's description of the development of the working class in Britain as being specific, and therefore the development of the workers' movement as being specific to the culture of the pre-industrial working class of Britain, as being something which was still very heavily connected to pre-capitalist forms, and that continued experience of sort of pre-capitalist forms, but then also like the non-factory-based forms of capitalist production that came before the introduction of the sort of Industrial Revolution, or the onset of the Industrial Revolution, was very specific to the early development of Chartism and the British trade union movement. But those conditions don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And in the same way that, like, those conditions that represented the conditions of potentiality that were contained within the history of Irish colonialism or British colonialism in Ireland don't really exist anymore. And I guess if there's something to take away from this essay, it's very much what he's saying. Like, you don't take any piece of history and the theories which stem from that piece of history and apply it to all history and all social
Yeah.
conditions anywhere in the world and anywhere in the human life world kind of thing.
Yeah.
But rather to keep an eye to the specifics of in all contexts kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it's quite daunting because it's like, well, what kind of agent are we looking for and
Yeah.
how do we rally them?
Yeah.
Where do they come from?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I mean, in some ways it's reminiscent to me of what maybe it was a throwaway topic and maybe it'd be good to develop it more, or to develop our understanding of it more, but something that that we read Mike McNair say, where it's like, maybe we need to move beyond politicking and the propagation of communist ideas in the factory and around the industrial working class and develop a much more a revolutionary strategy, I suppose, which is predicated on the community rather than the workplace kind of thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, they all fall prey to like the same economic laws of motion, so it would be a waste to just leave these people out. I remember a long time ago, I came across, you know what we should do is we should actually read, I know this is a little not in our wheelhouse, but it's a materialist show. We should try and read some Darwin.
Yeah.
Because I remember a long time ago, I came across this idea of like, evolution is not this like linear thing where it's like you start with little bird and then big bird eventually is working towards being the biggest bird, and eventually everything it does is getting to that point.
And eventually Big Bird is getting their COVID shot.
Exactly. Oh god, don't get me started. Avian flus. But it was trying to make the point that like evolution is something that's much more like everything all just kind of happens at once, and like it happens in response to these external factors. So it's like, you know, the typical example of like the Galapagos bird. The bird that eats the big nuts has to have the big beak, right? So it's like evolution isn't something that goes like this. The listener can't see what I'm doing, but it's not something that's like a gradual slope going upwards. It's something that is like much more static and like, but I mean, I don't know. I've always kind of tried to apply that idea to a theory of history, and it's kind of a little bit harder because obviously we have like external things that affect the way in which the class moves, and sometimes it moves all at once, and we call those things revolutions, and then the class struggle that is constant all around us molds us in kind of different ways that I don't know we necessarily understand because they just aren't necessarily as obvious. But like, yeah, also what you're saying, like history is always happening, even if we don't recognize every day as history, and the class is always being molded into something new. Maybe not something new, but something different, I suppose, if that makes sense. But yeah, I don't know. What I'm trying to say is we should read some Darwin. Another thing, just on what you were saying that I really found fascinating is we kind of talked about this already, but just the idea of like the specificity of his analysis and the kind of like quote unquote nationalism in his analysis, but also the implicit internationalism that is completely necessary. And this was only these theories were only really developed because of what happened with the Irish proletariat being thrown under the bus by the British trade union bureaucracy or the British proletariat or whatever. And so it's really a fascinating set of ideas that has this like nationalist aspect to them, but also this internationalist aspect, and how they're both necessary at the same time. It is, yeah, I don't know, it's fascinating. The implications for like, I don't know, neo-colonial, I guess, like class struggles is really interesting, but it's also like, what does that mean for like the core? I don't know. It's really interesting. Yeah.
What really interested me about the latter sections of this essay was he begins to develop this sort of comprehensive analysis which situates the Irish working class inside or internal to the development of capitalism, and takes this view which is very much that the conditions of existence of the Irish working class in the later stages of the 19th century and into the early stages of the 20th century are essential to an understanding of the development of capitalism, even though the conditions of their existence were very much not what you think of as being the prototypical industrial working class. They were not employed all year round in a specific factory location. They fulfilled the function of itinerant workers and immigrant workers in the UK, but also in Britain, but also they represented. They did a huge amount of the seafaring, a sort of navying work that was central to the circulation of commodities in all of northern, the sort of North Atlantic.
What is navvy? Isn't a word ever? Is that like?
I think they're just people who work on ships.
Okay.
There's a navvy.
A navvy. I'd never come across that word.
I don't know. Yeah, look it up. Because we're not going to fact check it.
Yeah, I'm not fucking like
Whatever. But also, like, they're being taken as slave. They're being taken as indentured servants. We learned a lot about the history of indentured servitude when we were reading about the early development of the American working class in the sort of pre-revolutionary period. So go check out that episode.
Philip Fonner episode.
But also they were essential to the development of the sort of itinerant nature of the certain sections of the American working class in the beginning of the 20th century. So he's making the case that the developing capitalism in this period of time was much more reliant on this kind of labor than people thought. The Irish working class didn't represent. It's almost like a global Irish working class at this point, in the extent to which they've spread across the sort of like the sort of like core portions of the world that were represented by capital or governed by capitalist mode of production at the time. The conditions of existence of the Irish working class were very central to capitalism, but then also this sort of history, these history 2 elements that they carried around with them were also central to the development of the anti-capitalist movements in those portions of the world where they continue to exist as well. I'm thinking particularly here of like the development of industrial unionism in America and the sort of the history of the IWW and other movements like that, which were very heavily centered around the sort of itinerant workers who would work in different industries and throughout the year kind of thing. So there's this sort of history 1 element, which is preconditions and conditions necessary to the development of capitalism, which is represented by what the Irish working class contributed to the development of capitalism, and then this history 2 element, which is those things which they carried with them, which capitalism couldn't eradicate, predicated on the nature of their existence, but was also central to the development of the working class movement at the time as well, and its resistance to capitalism.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, isn't it? Because he makes the point in this that he's like, clearly there's a connection between the transitory nature of the Irish worker and the development of the like one big union, revolutionary spontaneity kind of attitude. I really found that fascinating. Yeah, I don't know. It's something that still needs to cogitate a bit.
Yeah,
it's fascinating.
I mean, it still seems like quite a romantic description. If you just say that the Irish working class had this sort of sense of communality that stemmed from their ancient Celtic tribal roots, which led them to affiliate to industrial unionism and the sort of one big union concept kind of thing. But this essay is seeking to give that tendency a material basis. And so it's, as you say, interesting to cogitate on in the future.
Yeah, I don't know how much else I have left to say on this essay, but this idea is we need to come across some more developed ideas on revolutionary agency that is beyond just saying the proletariat, dude, they're going to do it, don't worry about it. Because this really was fascinating to be like, I mean, you need to look at the like real agency that exists, not necessarily just like on paper where this agency is, because as we've said that there is this like formal subsumption and real subsumption to capitalism that like different groups go through, and that actually affects their agency. Yeah, it's definitely something I'd like to develop, and I mean potentially try and adapt to today. It'll lead me perhaps back to my third worldist Maoist roots, but we'll see. Yeah, it's fascinating though.
Yeah. What I'm keen to take away from this is just yet more fodder for the sort of like specificity reading of history, and not to get too bogged down in generalities, but to see history as messy and an unfolding process, and to sort of tie these ideas to concepts that we've going round and round a bit with sort of what represents the elements of continuity that we see in history and what represents the elements of change that we see in history, and how do the two overlap.
It's strange, Dan, when you have a more specific understanding of history, that class is always at the center of it. Is class doing history, perhaps? I'm sure someone said that in a much better way than me. The class does history. Marx and Engels, 1848.
History is the class doing.
History is the class doing.
History is the doing of the classes.
Well, we can kind of say we've read some Gramsci now.
Yeah?
Yeah, we've read Gramsci.
And some James Connolly.
Yeah, I read all the prison notebooks in this essay. I was really interested when we started the show and in reading Miliband's book, when he brings up Gramsci as like, he basically says that like few people have really tried to understand why the proletariat hasn't developed in this way that it should, and where's the revolutionary agency, as Gramsci was one of the people to like actually try and develop that theory a little bit more. But I'm really interested in this idea of agency, and I think that like the thing that got me interested in it was coming across those ideas in Mike McNair, the idea of like the core proletariat versus the proletariat of the periphery. And the nation state is the firm and all of this stuff. So it's really fascinating. I don't know. And it helps a lot as like, you don't just want to be someone who goes around being like the proletariat dude, capitalism, bro. It's all just goddamn capitalism. It is all just goddamn capitalism, but yeah, it's good having that nuance and that specificity to understand the world. Is that true?
Yeah.
I suppose it is.
Yeah, what's good about this outlook, or sort of an outlook that could be inspired by this, I suppose, is that it allows you to circumnavigate or circumvent the question that a lot of Marxists at the beginning of the 20th century were asking themselves, which is like, why didn't the industrial proletariat do what it was supposed to do?
Yeah.
Like, what went wrong?
Idiots.
You know,
Yeah.
like that train of thought, which is represented by the Frankfurt School, but also Lukács or Gramsci, where it's just like something went wrong. Whereas this kind of outlook offers you a get out, which is to say, there is no should.
Yeah.
There is no ought.
Yeah.
There's just radical potentialities, I suppose.
Well, I also think too
And they
that
come
like,
and go with history.
yeah, absolutely. I think that like when you ask that question, you're getting a little dangerously close to idealism, because it's like it must just be all of the advertisements on the television that has stopped the proletariat. But it's like, no, you can come to like this conclusion of why hasn't the proletariat done what it's supposed to do, quote unquote. You can come to that conclusion through a material understanding of history. And it's really, really fascinating. I would like to have seen how Connolly's thought would have developed had he not been shot in the back of the head by a bunch of like assholes from England. But, you know, what are you going to do? Yeah. Fascinating stuff. Yeah, I don't know. It's almost like a bit of a Pandora's box question though, because it's like, oh God, do I really want to know why the like proletariat hasn't developed hasn't fulfilled its historical mission of getting rid of capitalism? I'm not sure that I do. It'll take too long.
It just leads down a route of like more and more pieces of red string on a bigger noteboard,
exactly.
a pinboard. You know, it's just like
yeah.
One day we'll master history.
I hope so. If there's anything I took from the Hillary Putnam, it's that we're just working towards a totality of understanding that is easily achievable.
Yeah. We'll get there. This podcast
is
will
that
achieve
box.
that human feat.
It's funny though, because it's like when you do look at history, like it's this weird kind of two-sided thing where it's like when you try to have this specific understanding of history, okay, I need to take the Irish Civil War and the Easter Rising for what it is and really delve into the reasons for why all of this stuff happened in Ireland, as opposed to trying to like take other things that happened and plot them on to Ireland. You get this weird kind of like, okay, everything is completely unique in its own way. Every historical event is completely like its own thing. But then you also get this like, wow, it is kind of all the same. Because like, you know, to sound basic, like class struggle is the engine of history, right? But it isn't just that simple. I don't know if that makes sense, but like...
Yeah. It's still capitalism.
It's still capitalism, folks. Yeah. Not a fan. Not a fan.
Wow. Well, I guess it's worth restating the long forgotten sort of theoretical underpinnings of this podcast in the search for the auxiliary statements.
We're going to find them.
And the general principles. I guess the general principle is it's still capitalism. and the auxiliary statements is all the historical specificity. Anyway.
We've kind of come full circle on that question that was put forward when discussing the auxiliary statement on the Irish working class.
The case that we came up with
This.
Marx's attitude towards the Irish working class.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, interesting. Was it in this that they said that Eleanor Marx was like, damn, Irish people, they're the most revolutionary ones. It's like, cool. That's very cool. I'd like to know more about Eleanor Marx. All right. Well, we will be back next week with something good.
Or in a few weeks' time.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we'll be back next week with something good, but it probably won't be a podcast.
Yeah. We should have said it at the start.
Yeah, I know.
That we decided to perhaps move
God damn it.
two weekly release schedule for a little while.
If you're not on our YouTube channel, constantly refreshing the page, waiting for us to release things, first of all, you should be. And secondly, you won't have noticed that we've been putting up more casual chats on YouTube. We did one last week in place of a podcast episode. Might do one next week if we can come up with things to talk about. That's the plan. And yeah, for now, every 2 weeks for the show. Because we were like, we'll read this essay and then we'll read this like very long book that like Connolly wrote on the history of the Irish working class. We'll do that. And it was like, we saw each other a couple days ago and it's like, you've only read the essay, right? And it's like, yeah. What are you gonna do?
We aspire to be able to put a bit more work into each episode by lengthening the time between the release of the episodes. But that does not mean that there will be any dearth of auxiliary statements content. You're just going to have to look a bit more further afield.
Very true.
Go subscribe to the YouTube channel and refresh it constantly.
Yeah. And also, if you do want to talk to us or comment and tell us how stupid we are, that's the place to do it.
Yeah,
because
Jack monitors that and he's good at replying.
Yeah, I'll be like, hey, thanks, cheers. The broad beans are in fact doing quite well. Thank you for asking. So yeah, go comment on our YouTube channel if you have something you want to say. Someone did just ask us about our broad beans, and I realized that I haven't gone to see mine in a very long time, so they might have all been dug up by the goddamn foxes. And it's been freezing recently, so who knows what's happened to my poor beans, but I'm sure they're fine.
They'll be fine. They're hardy.
They know what to expect.
They know what to expect.
That was, for the listener, there's a very nice old allotment lady who is constantly giving me advice, who knows a lot more than I do. And I was worried because I was like, I saved these beans and dried them out to be seeds from last year. And I'm worried that like they're not going to know what to do and they're not going to know what to grow. And she was like, don't worry. They know what to expect. And I was like, wow.
The genetic memory of the broad bean.
Yeah, exactly. They do know what to expect. Thank you very much. All right. Should we end this charade?
Yes, it should go on no longer.
Yeah. Sorry if there's been traffic noise. Because we're right by a busy street. So, I can't stop it.
We're not going to make any effort to mitigate that. We're recording slightly earlier, so we may have actually had less traffic noise. There hasn't been any like angry beeping of horns or anything.
I know. In the interview
Jack
that we
lives
did,
on a roundabout, and
there's
a lot of
honking
excessive
and
honking of horns.
Honking
and hollering.
Honking and hollering. In the interview we did with Bobby Wagner, the baseball episode, at one point you can just hear an argument outside. It's like a guy honks his horn and a lady's like, fuck you. And he's like, fuck you. And I'm just there like embarrassed, like, oh God, I hope you can't hear that. What are you going to do? Angry Brits, isn't it? Right,
It's the cultural specificity of the social existence of Great Britain. Yeah, God. This is what we've got to work with.
Yeah, this is what we got to work with, guys. Jesus Christ. All right. Well, support your local UCU officer. Maybe give them a nice back rub if you see them, because they're all working very hard. And we will be back eventually. My name has been Jack, Irish Jack as they call me, and I will see you next time. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Jack. I've been Dan. Thanks everybody for listening. This has been Auxiliary Statements, and we'll see you again. Woo.
The music you heard this episode was Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. If you like this song, you can check it out and much, much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. Be sure and follow us up on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you like what you heard, be sure and tune in next week for some more commie discussion. Till next time.